afternoon, everybody. On behalf of MSc, I welcome you all to this distinguished event, that is Shri Venkataraman Endowment Lecture. We will start today's program with a prayer. I request you all to keep your mobile phones in silent mode and rise for the prayer.
கடலுடுத்த நிலமடந்தை கெழிலொழுகும் சீராரும் பதனமென திகழ்வரத கண்டனிதில் வெக்கணமும் அதில் சிறந்த திராவிடனல் திருநாடும் தக்க சிறு பிறை முதலும் தரித்தனரும் திலகமுமே அத்திலக வாசனை போல் அனைத்துலகும் இன்பமுற எத்திசையும் புகழ் மணக்க இருந்த பெரும் தமிழனங்கே தமிழனங்கே உன் சீரிழமை திறம்பியங்கு செயல் மறந்து வாழ்த்துதுமே வாழ்த்துதுமே வாழ்த்துதுமே.
Today's event is one of the few special events which MSc organizes every year. Due to pandemic, we were not able to conduct these lectures for last 3 years. This year we are conducting the 8th edition of the lecture, and we are extremely happy to get the Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, as today's speaker. Before we proceed further, we would like to felicitate the dignitaries on the dais with bouquets. Ms. Ahili Maiti will give the bouquet to the chief guest. Ms. Yugantika Guha will give the bouquet to our chairman, Dr. Shri Rangarajan. Ms. Sejal Agarwal will give the bouquet to our director, Dr. K.R. Shanmugam. And Ms. Rohini will give the bouquet to Mrs. Lakshmi Venkataraman Venkateshan, daughter of Shri Venkataraman. Now I request our director, Dr. K.R. Shanmugam, to deliver the welcome address.
Respected Dr. C. Rangarajan, the Chairman of Madras School of Economics, former Chairman of Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister of India, and former Governor of Reserve Bank of India. Respected Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, the Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. Mrs. Lakshmi Venkataraman Venkateshan, the daughter of late former President Shri R.Venkataraman. Shri Gopalakrishna Gandhi, the former Governor of West Bengal, and other distinguished invitees, faculty and students from Madras School of Economics and from other institutions. I am extremely happy to welcome all of you for Shri R. Venkataraman Endowment Lecture, to be delivered today by our chief guest, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, titled India's Place in the Global Economic Landscape. MSc has 3 prestigious endowment lecture series: Dr. Rajachalaya Memorial Lecture, Shri G. Ramachandran Endowment Lecture, and Shri R. Venkataraman Endowment Lecture. Today we have 8th Shri R. Venkataraman Endowment Lecture. The earlier 7 endowment lectures were delivered by Dr. R.K. Pachuri, Dr. Vijay L. Kalkar, Dr. T.N. Srinivasan, Dr. Parthasarathi Som, Dr. D. Sibarao, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, then Dr. Bami Diva. Today we have Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran to deliver the 8th Shri R. Venkataraman Endowment Lecture. Dr. Another Nageshwaran received his PGDM from IIM Ahmedabad in 1985, PhD from University of Massachusetts in 1994. From 1996 to 2011, he worked at different capacities at the Union Bank of Switzerland, Suisse Private Banking in Asia, and Bank Julius Baer. He also served as independent directors on the board of TVS Supply Chain Solution, Sundaram Partners, TVS Chakra Tires, and Delphi TVS, etc. He has taught in several business and management schools in Singapore and also in India. He was the dean of IFMR Business School, Shri City. He is also the visiting faculty of economics at Kriya University, Chennai. He was a part-time member of Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister of India from 2019 to 2021. Currently, he is the Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India. Since January 2022, he has published 4 prestigious books. The titles of these books are: 1, The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences and Cues; 2, The Derivatives; 3, Can India Grow? And the 4th one is the Economics of Derivatives. So I am happy to welcome you, sir, and express our sincere gratitude for accepting our invitation to deliver 8th Shri R.Venkataraman Endowment lecture today at the Madras School of Economics. As you know, the Madras School of Economics was founded in 1995 by late Dr. Raja Chellaya. Currently our chairman is Dr. C. Rangarajan. MSc is a leading institution in both teaching and research in economics and management. We have currently 5 MA programs, namely MA General Economics, MA Financial Economics, MA Actuarial Economics, MA Applied Quantitative Finance, and MA Environmental Economics. So we have 2 postgraduate diploma programs in management, one in finance, the other one is business and analytics, research and business analytics. We have PhD programs in both economics and management. Recently, Government of Tamil Nadu recognized the Madras School of Economics as an institution of special importance by enacting a separate act and granting a degree award power to Madras School of Economics. We have been highly rated by the student community for our MA programs, and last year we started undergraduate programs in the BA Honours. Our courses are highly rated by the academic community. Our students are well placed. I think this year also, I think almost more than 90% of the students are well placed with the average salary package of almost closer to the new IIMs. Even economic students are getting the highest average salary in our institution. So with this, I am happy to once again welcome all of you for this 8th Shri R.Venkataraman Endowment lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now we are going to present a memento and shawl to our chief guest. So I request our chairman, Dr. C. Rangarajan, to present the memento first. And then our chairman and director together will present the shawl and also an honorarium. Now, Mrs. Lakshmi Venkataraman Venkatishan, daughter of Shri R. Venkataraman, will give a brief introduction about Shri R. Venkataraman.
Respected Dr. Shri Ananth Nageshwaran, Dr. Shri Rangarajan, Dr. Shri Shanmugam, distinguished guests, friends and admirers of the extraordinary personality, Shri R.Venkataraman. On behalf of my sister Padma and my brother-in-law Dr. Ramchandran, I would like to add the warm welcome to all of you from the R.V. family. In 1956-57, two Harvard PhD students, Lloyd and Susan Rudolph, came to India on a Ford Foundation Fellowship to study Indian democracy. This was not an academic exercise. They wanted to know how, if universal franchise would actually function in rural and urban India on the ground. I will share with you now briefly some excerpts from a letter written by the Rudolphs in March 1957. And I quote, "One of the key young emerging leaders we decided to actively follow was the parliamentary election campaign of R. Venkataraman, fondly known as RV, in Tanjavur district in the state of Madras. We were a little worried as the American embassy kept giving us so many warnings about appropriate behavior in the election trail. But RV brushed aside all these petty worries and he welcomed us wholeheartedly. And so we set out with him in a Land Rover. RV was a handsome man with a kind, gentle face and a great sense of humor. Obviously, the Rudolphs were greatly taken in by my father, the young RV. And as they followed around with him, they observed, and I quote, he seemed to have the full support of a whole range of trade unions, many of whom had traveled 250 miles, for them that was a long distance, I guess, from Madras to join him on the campaign trail. RV was on very good terms with the Chief Minister. He was equally at ease addressing large gatherings as he was in small informal meetings, meeting with the village headman, the panchayati head, or the owner of a small local coffee club, mingling with the poor and the illiterate in the rural backwaters. In fact, the Rudolphs have a historical picture of RV addressing an election gathering sitting atop a bale of hay in Pattukotte. The letter has some great insights on what elections were like and what it meant for someone like RV to actually educate and bring in the socio-economic status people as well as how women voted in those days. But in the end, the Rudolphs concluded in their letter, our campaign swing with RV taught us that India was indeed going to be a successful democracy, end quote. What an amazing start for a young man to be observed by people from a global group. Of course, the Rudolphs were now professors at Chicago University. RV's illustrious career, spanning over 70 plus years, is intrinsically woven with India's birth, growth, and development. Many esteemed members present here today, Shri Gopal Gandhi being one of the chief ones, have been part of RV's journey and are probably better equipped than I to tell the story. So rather than attempting to tell you all about the history of RV in my words, I will share with you my father's own words. In his own quintessential style, humble and practical, RV wrote about his extraordinary life in his memoirs, My Presidential Years. And I quote, "From Raja Madam village to Rashtrapati Bhavan in Delhi is a long journey. I began at the grassroots level and later became a trade union leader, all of which helped me rise to a position of a trade union lawyer to leader. In my early youth, I courted imprisonment, the Quit India movement, served the Congress first as an ordinary worker and later on as an office bearer before entering Parliament. I reached the top by climbing every rung of the ladder. My active participation in parliamentary proceedings attracted the attention of the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. For nearly a decade, he assigned me the cherished privilege of representing India as a delegate to the United Nations Assembly. The next step for me was to be appointed Industries Minister under the illustrious Kamraj, and successively to the office of the Union Planning Commission, Union Finance Minister, Union Defense Minister, Vice President of India, before being elected as 8th President of India. Now, can you believe it? That's it. In less than 10 sentences, R.V. summed up his entire exemplary career with absolutely no adjectives and no embellishments. That's it. Now, all of us would agree that there was so much more to his life, because this was the man whom Prime Minister Nehru appreciated and singled out very early in R.V.'s parliamentary career for his eloquence and forceful debates, and personally requested R.V. to represent India for more than a decade at the UN General Assembly. This was the man about whom P.M. Vajpayee said he had greatly admired his ability to make friends across the political spectrum. So P.M. Vajpayee said, I had special regard and high respect for him because he did not allow party considerations to come in the way of personal relations. In today's world, that's very, very high praise indeed. This was the man whom President Abdul Kalam credited for making India's missile program possible, thereby catapulting the country to a high level of self-reliance. This was the man who was feted by the armed forces. Admiral Kalyani and General Krishna Rao lauded him not only for his professional efficiency, but also for his care and concern for our soldiers and their families. This was the man who you all dubbed as the father of industrialization in Tamil Nadu, a minister with a mission to bring his agrarian home state of Madras to the top tier of India's entrepreneurial map. This was also the man who was not just respected, but cherished by so many artists, Padma Subramaniam, Vaijayanti Mala, Shobana Narayan, Amjad Ali, not only for his deep appreciation of the arts, but for his unstinting role as his patron. This was also the man who had a twinkle in his eye and loved to play with children. When he was 93 and his physical fitness was legendary, he participated in a tug-of-war on which my daughter and 30 of her friends was on one side and all the parents was, I'll say, aligned in the other side. And guess who won? And so when all the children found that my father was a great asset to have, at every birthday party he was insisting that he should be part of all the games. But over and all, above his accomplishments and awards, R.V. was a humanist. Perhaps the Lok Sabha tribute to Shri Venkataraman is beautifully said here. And I quote, R.V. possesses a rare equanimity like the Sthita Prajna. With an unshakable commitment to ethical values, R.V.'s greatness lies not in his having held positions of power or received innumerable accolades, but in the unassuming simplicity of his essential nature, the intense love he bore for his country, and the faith he had in his place in the annals of world history. I think Shri Gopal Gandhi, former governor and diplomat, who had served R.V. for over a dozen years, raised a very pertinent question, if you remember, Gopalji. And I quote you again, would R.V. be an anachronism today? Perhaps he would. And yet, R.V.'s era was not some bygone age. It was yesterday, so near, and yet so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for giving us these fascinating stories from the life of Shri R.Venkataraman. Now it's time for the most awaited lecture of today. I hereby request today's chief guest, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, the Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India, to deliver today's lecture. The title of the lecture is India's Place in the Global Economics Landscape. His lecture will be followed by a short question-answer session.
Respected Chairperson of the Madras School of Economics, Dr. Shri Rangarajan, Mrs. Lakshmi Venkataraman Endowment, Director Dr. Shanmugam, Shri Gopal Krishna Gandhi, former Governor of West Bengal, friends, students, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to all of you. As I address you as I share my thoughts with you in this 8th Shri R.Venkataraman Endowment lecture, it is indeed a sense of personal pleasure that I want to share in being able to speak in a lecture organized in his memory and in his honor. He was, as you heard just briefly a few minutes ago, a visionary leader, astute politician, intellectual, statesman, and of course the 8th President of India. He has been an inspiration for many of us since childhood. He had many feathers in his hat and always inspired the public to dream big. Former President Shri APJ Abdul Kalam remembered Shri R.Venkataraman in his book Wings of Fire, stating the following quote: "He advised us to list all the resources we needed to achieve our goals, overlooking nothing, and then include in this list our own positive imagination and faith. He said, what you imagine is what will transpire. What you believe is what you will achieve." Unquote. Starting as an independent lawyer, Shri R.Venkataraman was soon drawn into the country's freedom movement, as you heard. Later, after India's independence, he served in various capacities in public life as a legislator, government minister, union minister, vice president, and the country's president. The one thing that runs through all his various public roles is his vision for the country's economic development. In his tenure as a Minister of Industries in the erstwhile Madras state from 1957 to 1967, he transformed the state from an industrially backward status to India's third most industrialized state. He laid the foundation for the industrialization of Tamil Nadu with his pragmatic approach of greater private sector participation, supportive industrial climate for attracting investments, enhancing the ease of doing business before that became fashionable, and nurturing the MSME sector. He sowed the seeds of all-round industrial manufacturing ecosystem and economic development in the state of Tamil Nadu, as we can see today. He encouraged the establishment of large-scale industries like paper, aluminum, cement, and automobile auxiliary units. In fact, he was responsible for bringing the automobile industry into the state of Tamil Nadu during his tenure, and today Tamil Nadu accounts for over 1/3 of the production of automobiles and ancillaries in the entire country. As major enterprises were coming up in the state, he also envisioned the need for setting up small and medium industries to meet the requirements of parts and ancillaries that big companies would need. Industrial clusters of Tamil Nadu today stand as a testimony to his farsightedness. He was responsible for establishing the Gindi Industrial Estate and Ambattur Industrial Estate in Madras suburbs, which led to the formation of such industrial estates throughout the state. And these states have helped in nurturing MSMEs in Tamil Nadu, micro, small and medium enterprises. The introduction of single window clearance during his tenure provided a tremendous fillip to the industry, and he initiated the establishment of Tamil Nadu Industrial Development Corporation, TIDCO, which aimed at promoting industrial investment in the state. The reforms that Shri Venkataraman advocated four decades ago are still relevant for the Indian economy. Such a visionary he was. And during his tenure as Minister of Power in Tamil Nadu, the installed power generation capacity doubled in the state, and a massive rural electrification program was undertaken. Madras led all the other states in the percentage of electrified villages and the number of pump sets connected to power during his tenure. As a finance minister, he took forward the philosophy of encouraging larger participation of the private sector. He took over as a finance minister in January 1980 when India's economic outlook was extremely bleak and steered it through a period of turbulence and uncertainty. As an undergrad student, I remember reading in the Hindu those days, after one of his budgets came out, I still remember the headline very vividly in the Hindu, a classic defense of the forgotten middle class. That was Hindu's caption for his budget. If I'm not mistaken, in 1982 February budget, that is still evergreen in my memory. And when I saw her, when she came to my office to give me the honor and the privilege of delivering this lecture, I recall this particular headline to Mrs. R.Venkataraman Endowment as well. He heralded the reform policy for India by introducing the dual pricing of cement in 1980, thus liberating the age-old price control in cement. He introduced the scheme of bearer bonds in 1981 as an income disclosure scheme and announced export subsidies to meet the balance of payments of the country at that time. He was pragmatic enough to approach the International Monetary Fund for a special adjustment program which actually set the country on the path of economic reforms well before what we all speak of economic reforms of 1991. And they in turn paved the way for the national economic policy which we all know about since 1991. Having spoken about his vision, now the topic for today, therefore, his vision for India, his belief in economic reforms, his belief in industrialization, and his belief in private sector participation offers me a great segue into today's lecture, India's place in the global economic landscape. Slides off. I hope the people sitting in the back, can you see this clearly? Okay. No, I'll use this. Okay. An overview of the global economic landscape to start with before we understand where India is placed within this landscape. As you can see here, the IMF estimates global growth to be somewhat lower than the kind of numbers we have seen since 1980. This is for the world economy on your left. And in fact, in 23 calendar year, the red bar is a fairly short one, expecting that many countries would see even a recession. And for the world economy as a whole, a growth rate of around 2% is normally considered to be a recession zone. There is some recovery anticipated in 2024, that is why the final red bar is a bit longer. But the real issue that all countries are grappling with, as much as they are trying to make sure that growth doesn't stall, they also are grappling with high inflation rates not seen in 40 years. So you put the two together as students of economics, most of you would quickly be able to categorize the situation as one of potentially stagflationary conditions. Economic growth stagnation and persistent and sticky inflation. Even as central banks raise interest rates, we must remember one thing, even now in developed countries, real interest rates are still negative. Which means if we have to see the back of inflation, then nominal interest rates have to rise a lot more to be able to bring the inflation rates down to 2%, which was their target before the inflation rate spiked up in 2022. Now, but we don't know whether their economies can withstand such extremely high levels of nominal interest rates such that real rates can become positive. That is the biggest uncertainty that we all face as we navigate the rest of 2023. On your left, you can see that there is a global uncertainty index, which is based on newspaper articles and reports that use the word uncertainty. And while it is fluctuating, by and large, the trend since about 2017 has been upward, which means uncertainty has been rising by and large, and that is no surprise. But what it also means is that investment decisions will be affected, not investment in speculative assets for which people need uncertainty actually, but people who make real investment decisions in plant and machinery and capital assets, they will be hamstrung by the elevated levels of uncertainty, which is why in the last several years, the government of India had taken upon itself to drive the public investment program to keep up economic investments happening. So that is something that is going to stay with us for the next several years. On the right side, some of you who track these things would have probably heard of the testimony that the US Federal Reserve chairperson gave to the Congress. And whether we like it or not, even now, since the United States is a global currency, the United States therefore rightly or wrongly sets the global monetary policy, and the United States stock market, rightly or wrongly, is the parameter of global stock market. Well, that still remains the case, much as we would like to believe that we have entered a multipolar world. We have not yet done so, okay? It still remains a US-dominated world of economics and finance. And what he said was, inflationary pressures are running higher than expected at the time of our previous Federal Reserve Open Market Committee meeting. Restoring price stability will likely require that we maintain a restrictive stance of monetary policy for some time. And that naturally means that as interest rates rise in dollar terms, many smaller economies which have borrowed in dollar will face higher debt repayment, debt servicing cost. And we know that a neighboring country, which was until 4 years ago a middle-income country, is now on its way to becoming a low-income country because of the high amount of dollar borrowings that it had done. And that is a situation that not just one or two, but several countries in the world face. And as the US continues to maintain a higher interest rate or looks to raise interest rates even further, that stress will remain in the world. We all thought we put them behind us in 2022, but I think it is going to stay with us perhaps well into 2023 as well. Apart from that, the next uncertainty that we are going to face is the fracturing global value chains. That is, the world was very comfortable outsourcing production of different components to the most efficient producing country around the world. Just-in-time inventory. So profitability maximization meant that there was a premium placed on efficiency. But post-pandemic, post-US-China tensions, there is now a premium placed on security. As you might have read, just-in-time has given way to just-in-case kind of attitude towards production. You need to have backups now, and that means costs will rise, okay? And of course, the conflict in Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine war, has implications for global security and also has big implications for how the oil price itself will behave, because we saw last year the war and the resultant embargo on food and fertilizer shipments meant food, fuel and fertilizer prices went up quite sharply, and that uncertainty has not fully vanished. Climate change, some of us know that in February the temperature in Delhi was supposedly the highest in 63 years, and we have a forecast for El Nino conditions in India this summer. But more than handling higher temperatures, developing countries have a difficult choice to make. What is the macroeconomic cost of putting our resources towards climate change? It will be somewhat naive to wish away the short-run macroeconomic consequences of dealing with climate change, because resources are not infinite, and there is a trade-off, and we need to decide. That is one trade-off we have to decide between economic aspirations and tackling climate change. It is unrealistic to think that it is a win-win. Definitely not in the short run. And second, there is a trade-off even within climate change management. There is a trade-off between adaptation and resilience and carbon emissions mitigation. Emission mitigation is a concern for developed countries. Developing countries, having not contributed to the stock of emissions out there in the atmosphere and may not be contributing in a big way for several more years, would be better off spending their resources on adapting themselves and making themselves more resilient to climate change already underway. Because the biggest unknown is, no matter how much efforts you put in for emission mitigation, the stock of atmospheric greenhouse gases already out there may have meant that global warming would happen regardless of the efforts you undertake going forward. So given that, countries have a choice to make. Do you therefore put all your resources on bringing down your carbon and greenhouse gas emission, or do you put your resources to making sure that you are able to enable your citizens to adapt and live with global warming and other climate volatility? That is a big choice that all countries, including India, have to make in the coming years. And if we have to therefore adapt to climate change and grow, we have to make sure that resource energy is available to all of us. And not only we have to give up the reliance on fossil fuels like coal, gas, oil, we have to ensure that the share of renewable energy sources in our overall energy mix rises. And in order to do so, we have to make sure that we have supplies of rare earths and critical minerals, which are available only in a few countries around the world and processed predominantly in one single country. May I ask the students assembled here, which country has a predominant role in the processing of critical minerals and rare earths? Otherwise, if it's a monologue at 3:30 in the afternoon, is surefire recipe for catching up with your sleep shortfall.
Australia, sir?
No. China. In terms of processing, the single largest processor of rare earths and critical minerals in the world is China. But the availability is restricted to a few countries: Congo, Ghana, Australia, Peru, etc. But that is why the well-known energy expert Daniel Ergin thinks that rare earths and critical minerals would become a geopolitical weapons as oil has been in the last 30 to 40 years. So this is the global landscape within which we have to navigate our growth in the coming years. Now, all of you are familiar with these numbers, I suppose. We had a real economy contraction based on revised numbers recently of minus 5.8% in 2020-21. But even before that, in 1920, in the pre-pandemic year, the real economy growth was already down to 3.9, and I will be explaining to you why that was happening. That growth was not just affected by the pandemic, but growth was slowing before the pandemic, and that is the reason we actually can look ahead to a period of better growth in the coming years. And then, of course, the recovery years, 21-22, 9.1%, and the current year, which is going to end in a few weeks, expected number is 7%, and mind you, this number has at least 3 or 4 more revisions to go. Okay? Many of you may not know, Ministry of Statistics puts out 6 estimates of GDP growth. First advance, second advance, preliminary, first revision, second revision, third revision. So the final number which they put out is the third revised estimate, which comes sometime in 2024 or maybe in February 2025, when you will get the final number of how well we did in 22-23. Okay? And next financial year, 23-24, the economic survey said we will grow at 6.5%, roughly speaking, but we gave a range of 6 to 6.8. And the reason why we didn't put the midpoint as our base number is to send a message. And what could be that message? When you choose 6 to 6.8 as a range and pick the baseline number as 6.5, what is the message we were trying to send?
You're confident that you'll get to 6.8 and be at 6.
Huh?
give a perspective that you are more confident to get closer to 6.8 than to get closer to 6?
No, on the other way around. Basically, we said the downside possibility is 50 basis points, the upside possibility only 30 basis points. So we were saying that the downside risks dominate the upside to our number of 6.5. That is why we didn't choose a midpoint, or for that matter, basically given the kind of scenario I painted earlier, we have to accept the fact that downside risks are still more than upside potential or upside scope surprise for this 6.5%. But nonetheless, it is important for us to place our numbers in the context of where the rest of the world is. For India, it is not a calendar year, it is the financial year 23-24. So on the x-axis, we have real GDP of 6.5%, and the expected inflation rate is somewhere between 5 and 6 for 23-24. So to be further out on the right with respect to real GDP is a good thing. And to be somewhere in the middle with respect to inflation is not a bad thing. So therefore, as a combination of growth and inflation outcome for 23-24, we are not badly placed. If anything, that's an understatement. We are quite comfortably placed, although risks are there, which we will talk about. And other international organizations give us a number, something like 5.7 to 7.2 is the range. Some private sector organizations do have a number which is even lower than 5.7%. It's possible. I mean, nothing is, so we have 3 different levels of possibilities: possible, plausible, and probable. So in terms of possibilities, you could have a number that is lower than 5.7, but it's quite unlikely that in 23-24 we would exceed the Asian Development Bank's estimate of 7.2% for real GDP in 23-24. But nonetheless, there has been a lot of talk in the newspapers about how India's growth rate in the third quarter of 22-23, which we got the estimate about a couple of weeks ago, was only 4.4%, and whether the Indian economic recovery is stalling. The reason why we had a slightly lower number for the third quarter, which is October to December 2022, is because the previous year's numbers have been revised higher, so the base becomes larger. And you are comparing numbers which have been already revised 3 or 4 times to a number that is still preliminary based on incomplete data. So based on the trends we are seeing in higher frequency data, whether it is passenger vehicles, housing sales, sale of two-wheelers, you look at aircraft passengers handled, commercial vehicles, tractors, etc., the momentum in the economy is quite good, which means there is a much higher chance that these numbers that you saw recently for 22-23 are likely to be revised higher rather than revised lower. So the momentum is on the right side. And what about the external sector? After all, we are a country that is dependent on oil imports. We import 85% of our fuel requirements, and we have a trade deficit in general, in spite of the fact that our services sector records a good surplus in terms of exports over its imports. Where do we stand? And there again, we are pretty well off in the global community of nations that we normally compare ourselves against. If you look at the US dollar denominated credit, that is how much Indian enterprises or the government have borrowed in dollars, we are one of the lowest in the world. What about the international reverse? We are the reserves, we are the middle of the pack as a percentage of annual imports. And current account balance at the beginning of the current financial year, if you recall, back in April, May 2022, there was a lot of concern whether the war in Ukraine would lead to much higher and persistently high oil price, leading to a current account deficit of 3.5–4% of GDP, etc. And there were dark mutterings of repeat of 2012-13, etc. When we had the taper tantrum and India was considered one of the fragile 5 economies in terms of current account deficit, a falling rupee, higher fiscal deficit, etc. But now, as we are in March, the estimates for current account deficit for 22-23 have been revised substantially better by even the private sector analysts, We expect the current account deficit to be around 2.2-2.3% of GDP, as against the feared number of 3.5 to 4% for 22-23, and for next year, of course, subject to where the oil price is, it should be closer to 2% or even slightly below. So the external sector, external balance at the moment isn't flashing any danger signals for us. I told you we had a growth shortfall even in 1920. And I said that actually sets up the stage for us to be more constructive and hopeful in the coming decade. And that is what I'm going to turn to next. What happened in India in 2011-20? That is, India went through a classic financial and credit cycle, a boom and bust cycle. 2000 to 2010, India's debt ratios, whether it is the private sector as a whole or private corporate sector alone, you can see on the left side, the debt to GDP ratio went up by 40 percentage points in the first decade if you look at the entire non-financial private sector. If you look at the non-financial corporate sector alone, it went up by about 30 percentage points. And look at the bank credit. India's bank credit to GDP ratio was just stagnating around 27-28% of GDP for the better part of 1980 to 2000. Never went anywhere. Around 27% it was languishing. Suddenly in the first decade of the millennium, it shot up to 55% of GDP. So imagine, in a decade when GDP growth had accelerated, the numerator had grown even faster, for the ratio to double from 27-28% to 55% of GDP. Too many loans were given, too many loans were taken. And naturally it led to a period of indigestion. Companies and the private sector had to trim their balance sheets, debt to GDP ratio had to come down, companies sold off assets, banks withdrew from lending, credit growth came down to single digits, and what you see on the right side is a chart taken from the Bank for International Settlements, which tells you the credit to GDP gap. What is a gap? Gap between the actual minus trend growth rate. When this number is well above zero, which means your actual credit to GDP ratio is rising well above the trend, which is unsustainable, which is therefore followed by a period of below trend growth, as you see here between 2011 and 2020. So there is a hump and there is a valley, and therefore we feel, having done the hard work last decade, we are poised for better credit growth and better investment growth once the current shocks fade away, commodity prices, oil price uncertainties, etc. In other words, as a country, we paid our growth dues in the second half of the last decade. And this is very similar to what happened between 1998 and 2002. Between 1998 and 2002, as it happened last decade, India was recovering, and Dr. Venkataraman was the RBI governor until 1997. He can correct me if I'm wrong. He in fact had high positive real interest rates in that period, which basically pressured the banking system and the corporate system to deleverage, to make the balance sheets leaner and meaner. And then, on top of that, we tested a nuclear device and faced sanctions. We had successive years of drought in 1998 and 99. And then the tech bubble burst and ended. 9/11 happened. We had a global recession. All these things were happening, but underneath all these things, there were some reforms happening. The golden quadrilateral, interest rate deregulation, telecom sector liberalization, and the beginnings of asset recovery systems like today's insolvency and bankruptcy code, where forerunners were put in place, etc. But none of them actually helped GDP growth in that period, because the bigger shocks were dominating the effects of the reforms. But once those shocks faded away and the global conditions turned somewhat friendlier, the lagged effect of those reforms and the combined with the leaner and meaner and better balance sheets in the banking system and in the corporate sector helped India ride the global growth wave from 2003 until 2012, with the exception of 2008. So that is the kind of parallel situation we face today. We have gone through the hard work between 2015 and 2020. Banks and corporates are now better in terms of financial strength. We had a single indirect tax system in the country. We have an insolvency and bankruptcy code. Infrastructure build out is happening. And there was a Real Estate Regulation Act, and on top of that you have a digital infrastructure put in place. But before we could reap and enjoy the benefits of all these reforms, the financial system had to be repaired, which happened all the way until 2020. And by then, we had the pandemic, and once the pandemic got over, we had the war in Ukraine with commodity price shock. So that is the analogy we are drawing between what happened 2 decades ago and what is likely to happen in this decade. And what you see in this slide is, of course, how the banking system has repaired itself with lower non-performing assets, higher provision coverage ratio, etc. And some of you who track these things would know that RBI's stress test clearly show that the Indian banking system is currently well placed. And you are seeing that in the credit growth numbers, picking up from 6% in calendar year 20 up to 12.7% in calendar year 2022, and there is a robust loan demand from all sectors. Now the question is whether RBI's rate hikes would kill this appetite for better credit. The answer in my view is no. I want to take you back to the mid-90s in the United States, which is a golden era for the US economy. Real interest rates were higher at 3%, real interest rates. Dollar was strong. But in spite of that, the US economy was growing very well. The real interest rates were not a constraint on growth, but the real interest rates reflected a healthy appetite for credit. Similarly, today's real interest rates in India are not going to be a deterrent for economic activity, but will reflect a better demand for credit in the coming year. Therefore, I don't see it as being a constraint on economic growth as many people fear. And because of this balance sheet repair in the private sector, naturally the most creditworthy borrower in the country had to take upon himself or herself the job of sustaining investments, and that was naturally the Government of India. And that is why capital investments by Government of India went up from 4.5 crores, not only its direct spending, but also capital grants, including loans to states. The overall capital expenditure commitment went from 4.5 to roughly $13.7 trillion for the coming financial year. And the quality of public expenditure has improved, as you can see on the right side. Capital expenditure in the government's budget was barely 12.3% in the financial year 2017-18. It has now improved to 22.2%, which means the revenue expenditure is 78% as opposed to 88% about 5 years ago. So in spite of all of this, some people are correctly concerned whether the private sector will ever step in and pick up the baton from the government in terms of running with the investment cycle. The evidence is encouraging, even though it could be better. The private sector investment on the ground in real assets is about 3.3 lakh crores or 3.3 trillion rupees in the first half of the current financial year, and it has been rising very steadily in the last 2-3 years. And 10 out of 10 sectors, we have seen better investments this financial year compared to the last financial year, as you can see on the right. Naturally, employment elasticities indicate that once private sector investment picks up, employment generation will follow, which is exactly what happened in the first decade of the millennium. That was one of the better periods for employment growth because corporate investments and private sector investments happened. And we need to make sure that, remember, the last decade was not just a bad decade for bank balance sheets and corporate investments. Even India's real estate cycle went through a down period. Some of you in the audience who are part of the asset management and broking industry would be able to verify what I'm saying. India went through a bad credit cycle, a bad financial cycle, and a bad real estate cycle as well between 2011 and 20. That is why the performance of Indian economy in that decade was below expectations set by the previous decade's stellar growth rates. In a sense, we paid the price for unsustainable growth of the previous decade in the second decade of the millennium. And while we all talk about the fiscal deficit being on the high side, and it is coming down slowly after the pandemic pushed it up to 9.2% because the denominator contracted, the numerator went up because we had to provide for extra security expenditure after April 2020 incident in Galwan, and we had to do the pandemic-related vaccination and other expenditure. And therefore, it is coming off slowly towards expected 5.9 next financial year, and the government is targeting 4.5% for 25-26. But what I would like you to focus on is the much more meaningful improvement in revenue deficit and primary deficit compared to the gross fiscal deficit, which tells you that interest payments are naturally a bigger component of the overall fiscal deficit. You can do the math yourself. And that is why, going forward, asset monetization is very important for India, for the government to trim its own liabilities, debt stock, and reduce the interest payments as a percentage of its overall revenue collection and have more money left over for financing development. What I show on the right side top is what you saw earlier, the improvement in the quality of government expenditure. In the bottom chart, you see the improvement in tax collections, both corporate taxes and personal income taxes, which is what has helped the government to make the improvement towards higher capital expenditure rather than revenue expenditure. And I also want to give you a sense of perspective about, some of the hand-wringing with respect to the public finances. While it is definitely something we need to keep stressing to all organs of government, federal, federal, states, and local governments, to put the numbers in perspective, between 2005 and 2021, India's overall public debt has gone from 81 to 84%, and only two other countries have done better than India, Germany and Indonesia, whereas everybody else has seen a massive increase in their public debt. Just yesterday, the United States released the details of its budget. Let me see how many of the students here caught up with the world's largest economy's budget. What is the projected budget deficit of the United States for next year? India is 5.9, as we know, 23-24. What is the United States number? Anybody? Okay, you need to keep up with the news flow, and it is not just for people in the financial industry, it's important for you as well. 6.8% of GDP will be the US fiscal deficit, the federal government deficit. Okay, of course you might say, the United States can borrow in its own currency. Well, India also borrows in its own currency. Indian government doesn't borrow in foreign currency, nor does the Indian government sell too much of debt to non-residents as well. And this is what Dr. Y.V. Reddy once said in 2018 in a speech, that the Western angst about the fiscal deficit should be tempered with the reality of India borrowing in its own currency and also owing much of its money to Indian residents rather than non-residents, whether you borrow in your own currency or foreign currency. Anyway, I'm sure Dr. Rangarajan has different views on this. So on my right, what I show here is that the growth interest rate differential for India is on the positive side, going to remain positive, because India's nominal GDP growth will be at the minimum 10% in the coming years. And if the cost of government borrowing is going to be somewhere between 7 and 8%, you have a positive differential between growth and interest rates, which is what many of us would know makes the public debt sustainable. And in the economic survey, chapter 3, this year, which we brought out a month ago, we have a box item showing a counterfactual analysis. Suppose India had a nominal GDP growth of 10% in 1920, 2021 and 21-22 instead of the actual numbers. What would have been India's fiscal deficit now? Or what would have been India's public debt now? Actually, they would have been far lower than the official numbers, which simply tells you that we are somewhat influenced by the recent history, which has been affected by one-off unprecedented factors. Once we return to a period of reasonably sustainable moderate growth rate, these fiscal parameters would show distinct and significant improvement. That's my point. The other thing which is an important development which has happened in spite of the balance sheet repair I talked about in the banking system and corporate system is that formalization of the Indian economy is underway. And even a skeptical newspaper like The Economist had to acknowledge it, that it wrote an article sometime in November 2022 saying that one day you may not find payment vendors and hawkers in India because they all have become formal enterprises. This is what The Economist conceded is happening in India. And we see that in the GST data. Before GST was introduced, about 6.6 million taxpayers were there paying sales tax in the country. Now it is 14 million of them, probably 15 as I speak. The average tax paid by those who migrated to the new system from the old system is about 4.2 lakh rupees per annum. The average tax paid by the new entrants to the GST is about 1.1 lakh per annum. What does it tell you? The new entrants are largely smaller enterprises. So they pay lower GST compared to the average tax paid by the ones who migrated from the old system to the new system. And that's a good thing. And why does formalization matter? Somebody tells me cynically, formalization means that what you were not counting earlier, you are counting now, but the aggregate economy size hasn't changed. The answer to that is, formalization is going to bring about financial inclusion, opportunities for getting credit, other products, insurance, etc. Formalization also opens market opportunities. And I would encourage some of you to read a World Bank publication that came out in November 2022, available for free download, called Hidden Potential, wherein they say, once an informal enterprise becomes part of the e-commerce, their growth rates actually match that of the formal enterprises. This is a World Bank study of South Asia. It is not a World Bank study of the rest of the world. It is applicable to South Asia. And naturally, India leads other South Asian nations in e-commerce. So that's a good thing. That is where the new developments such as open network digital commerce, open credit enablement network, ONDC, GST Sahai, which enables a micro, small, medium enterprise supplier to a large enterprise. On the basis of the GST invoice, he or she can basically get working capital funding. While MSME associations, when they speak in public, naturally they list all their pending grievances. On a one-on-one basis, most of them confess, including the office bearers, that their order books are doing quite well. So, the emergency credit line guarantee scheme played a very big part in ensuring that the MSME sector did not suffer unduly. That said, let me concede, there is still much work to be done for India to have a credible and sizable middle start. We are going to face somewhat unique problems because society as a whole, not just the rest of the world, including in India, we are going to have issues with the millions of people aging, elder care, mental health. All these issues are important. That is why some of these skills cannot be replicated or replaced by machines or artificial intelligence. So we have to prepare our youth for the right skills for the 21st century. And preventive healthcare infrastructure, and making sure that states also plug themselves into monitoring global trends. It is not just a responsibility of the Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Finance, but even state governments have to have local level partnerships with countries and districts and states across the world. And state initiatives to support their own revenues must continue to happen. It is one thing to say that GST has taken away the federal nature of tax structure, but it is another thing to fully utilize the space that states have to augment their own revenues. In the interest of time, I won't go into the details, but several states are beginning to do that, as I have mentioned towards the bottom of the right side, and that is a good thing. And energy transition, and I alluded to this in the beginning of my talk, whether there is a trade-off between growth and climate change, and within climate change between adaptation and mitigation. I would like to leave this quote by Professor Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in 2005, and he wrote this article in 1992 in American Economic Review, and this is worth repeating. If per capita income growth in the next 40 years compares with the 40 years just past, he wrote in 1992, vulnerability to climate change should diminish, and the resources available for adaptation should be greater. I say this not to minimize concern about climate change, but to anticipate whether developing countries should make sacrifices in their development to minimize the emission of gases that may change the climate to their disadvantage. Their best defense against climate change may be their own continued development, unquote. In other words, many of us who are in the corporate sector would know that the first source of funding the corporate sector turns to is before that? Sorry?
Own capital.
Yes, thank you. The first source of resource that a company would turn to is always its own accumulated earnings. Internal resource generation is the first source that they turn to before they look at external source of funding. The same logic applies to countries. The first source of funding is your own generation of resources, which happens only when there is continued growth. So in fact, I would say developing countries should be given a window of the next 7 to 10 years to grow first before they can take on mitigation targets. And during this period, they should build their adaptation and resilience defenses against climate change. Because the pandemic and then the commodity price shock, their debt levels have all basically hurt their ability to grow. Now, if we impose on them climate change obligations because developed countries are nervous about mitigation of carbon and greenhouse gas emission, we will be cutting the very ground from under the feet of developing countries by which they generate the resources that can be used to fund their own climate obligations. Because dependence on foreign source of funding is easier to say in textbooks or newspaper articles. What is the first thing you will be concerned about if your economy is going to be reliant excessively on foreign financing? As a student of macroeconomy, what would be your first concern? Interest rates?
Interest rate rise in the future.
I'll give you a clue. National income accounting identity. That's a hint. Before that.
Money going away.
No. The clue I gave is national income identity. If you have to attract so much of foreign funding, you must have a very large current account deficit. What is the level of current account deficit that the markets would tolerate? How can you attract trillions of dollars of funding without running correspondingly larger current account deficit? Is that feasible? Is that desirable? And will the fickle private sector keep funding you? If so, at what cost? Without all these questions being addressed, to talk somewhat loosely and naively about private sector will be able to fund climate change investments, therefore you must make it easier for private sector to fund climate change and energy transition needs, is to leave so many questions unanswered. That is why these days I am very heartened by the fact that John Pisani-Ferry of the Bruegel Institute is beginning to talk about the macroeconomic cost of energy transition. That has been left unaddressed, unexplored, unexamined. So in terms of concluding remarks, and again some of you students of economics would know that Joan Robinson said in the 1960s that whatever you say about India, complete the sentence please. Whatever you say about India, the opposite is equally true, right? So, it is never the case that no matter how good we look, that there isn't an unfinished agenda of tasks, challenges and priorities, etc. Even sticking purely to the economic side, we have much to do in terms of education and skilling. We have much to do in terms of improving the climate for industries. And within the private sector, we have much to do in terms of improving the R&D content of our expenditure, in terms of our willingness to pay micro, small and medium suppliers on time, etc. And as we mentioned earlier in the remarks about energy transition, access to critical minerals, etc. and making sure that our agriculture is not going to be a net exporter of water. In other words, by reducing our reliance on production of wheat and rice towards other products, etc., which are not necessarily water intensive. These are all ongoing challenges. But I would like to actually take heart from what one of the private sector economists, Richard Etzinger of the ANZ Bank, wrote in Nikkei Asia last month. He said, it is the unfinished and pending agenda is what gives the upside for India. Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience?
I have two questions. Question number one is, what's the basis for your growth projections? Do you have, is it pulled out of a hat, or do you have any univariate time series decomposition which gives you these growth projections, which is in the economic survey that you showed us? And if so, what are the standard error bands? Number two, modern growth literature suggests that long-term economic growth depends on the quality of institutions, social infrastructure. So, what I notice, at least that's my personal opinion, is the current political dispensation has been systematically eroding the nature of the quality of institutions in India and systematically undermining the quality of institutions. This includes the RBI, the SEBI, and the freedom of press, etc., etc. So what will be, are these things taken into account in your growth projections? I mean long-term growth projections. Thank you.
May I ask the next question? What are your thoughts about the declining savings rate? And do you think the new tax regime will, kill the savings rate culture?
Any other question?
Hi sir, I'm Sanjeev. I'm a faculty here in Madras School of Economics. My question is regarding the penultimate slide that you showed here on the developing countries' concerns on gas emissions. Is it really possible for a developing country to remain independent of the outsourcing, manufacturing outsourcing decisions of the developed country, and then completely be concerned only about their own way of development? In other words, is it really possible not to be completely dependent on the developing countries for business? Several countries are desperate to stay in business because, in some sense, there are the developed countries have options of looking for a different partner, particularly in the context of a global value chain framework. So that would be my question on this.
So I will take the first set of three questions. We'll take the first set of three questions regarding the growth estimate. I'll share the details of our model with you separately. We do depend on the estimates put out by international agencies which have their own model, and they pick the potential growth rate at 6%. Whereas in the early decade of the millennium, the number was somewhere between 7 to 8% because we also had export growth kicking in. In this decade, I'm relatively less optimistic about export growth contributing. So I take the baseline of 6%, which is based on labor force growth and productivity growth, and the addition of 50 basis points that I expect, therefore I'm putting the medium-term projection of 6.5%, is coming not from a quantitative estimate, but from my belief that the digitization of the Indian economy and the recovery of the financial cycle and the investment cycle, which was missing in the last decade, will add another 50 to 80 basis points to the potential estimate of around 6%, which many international agencies put out as their expectation of India's potential. The second question, whether institutions are being damaged, I don't see, for example, last year when Reserve Bank of India was tightening interest rates from 4 to 6.5%, I don't think the central government spoke about interest rate increases at all. Even in developed countries, many treasury departments and finance ministries have been making comments about their central banks raising interest rates. We did not. So therefore, to argue and paint with a very broad brush, I would take it as a statement and not a question, and it is a statement without substantiation. And the second point I would make to you is that we can have a debate on whether institutions precede economic growth or institutions are a consequence of economic growth. But that is a debate we need to have separately. Now, as far as your question about savings rate, the new tax regime does not discourage savings. In fact, it gives you the choice to have your own savings instead of saving in specific instruments of a particular size, etc. In today's youngsters, if they don't want to own a house, etc., they don't need to worry about interest rate reduction or mortgage payment that they can claim credit for, etc. Therefore, they would be very happy to invest in the stock market directly rather than channeling it through ATC designated instruments or some other tax saving fixed deposits, etc. So I'm not sure that it is a sort of a danger or a threat to the savings culture as much as it puts the choice in the hands of the taxpayer to decide which approach they want to adopt. And mind you, they have a choice to switch between both tax regimes 1 year after the other. Every year you can make a switch between new and the old tax system, with exemptions, with no exemptions, and only as long as you don't have a business income to report. So it alters the composition of the savings. That may happen, but I'm not sure it actually discourages savings. In any case, my understanding is, again, Dr. Rangarajan may supplement, savings is sort of endogenous to the national income. Right, as incomes grow, savings rise as well, and India's savings rate picked up quite substantially in the first decade of the millennium until 2012, etc., as national income growth was rising at a faster rate. And then from 2012 to 2030, by and large, the overall income growth was weaker, as we saw in the presentation, for the reasons of financial cycle. So my expectation, again, even though it is only moderate because we don't expect export growth to be a very important contributor, if we are able to sustain a real GDP growth of around 6.5%, maybe achieve 7%, or nominal GDP of around 10%, we do think that the savings rate and the investments rates would begin to rise in the rest of the decade. Much of our current commentary or our own thoughts, or whether we like it or not, subconsciously influenced by the events of recent years, which were marked by sluggish growth for reasons of financial cycle that we went through. Could you please, sorry, I repeat the question that you posed on the critical minerals and rare earths will be dependent on developing countries first?
No, it's the other way. Dependent on the developed countries.
Will we be dependent?
No. I'm asking. I mean, the current situation is that there is a dependency relation between the developed and the developing countries. So is it really possible to move out of that situation?
To break the dependence.
Yeah, to break the dependency and
for rare earths and critical minerals.
Not necessarily. I think I broadly talked about the manufacturing as such in the context of value chain. In the context of global value chains,
global value chains.
Yeah, in the context of that, mostly manufacturing, not necessarily.
Right. Well, I mean, we are not. Today's global value chains are not so much dependent on the developed countries as they are dependent on China and Mexico, Vietnam and Bangladesh to some extent. So it is not true that the global value chains are structured around developed countries as much as they are structured around. So if the question is whether we could break the dependence on China of the global value chains, that would be, in my opinion, a much more relevant question to ask. And that would take time. Because if you look at anything, any of these today's electronic components, for example, far too many components are sourced from China. So in order to move the production of any single item, the amount of components and sub-assemblies that needs to be also moved from China, they are quite tremendous. So would that happen? Will be a fair question to ask. So I'm not sure that the production structure is too much dependent on developed countries as much as they are dependent on China. But what we are hearing, and this is the beginning, I mean, the sense that it is difficult to be able to say right away that it will happen within a particular time frame, or at least I can't do that. But what we are hearing, and somewhat anecdotally, is that due to the rapidity of the regulatory changes that happened in China in the last 2-3 years, there is, and due to the way in which the pandemic itself was handled in the beginning of 2020, etc., and in terms of information disclosure and transparency, there is definitely a concern which is not aired very publicly by many multinationals that they do want to diversify or relocate. So that is something which we are beginning to see. And naturally, the first choice that they go to is to countries with a similar culture to China. Therefore, Vietnam has been their natural choice. And then Bangladesh has carved a niche for itself in some areas. We are relatively late compared to these countries. But hopefully, if we can show success stories as we are doing in pharma and telephone equipment, and extend it to electronics and some other sectors, then I think the success will breed its own success. So, but it is something that we need to be somewhat patient about. But the advantage of the PLI scheme is that if the companies who obtain that PLI license, if they don't produce, they don't get the incentive. So there is no fiscal cost to it. If they succeed, you get paid. If you don't produce, you don't get paid. And as I mentioned in my remarks a couple of days ago, even if 4 or 5 sectors out of 14 succeed, where we manage to plug ourselves into the global value chain, that is still a good success ratio.
Yeah, for a country that is yet beginning to, like, that would be a high success ratio. But it's just, okay, yeah, if you think of only country, India as a country, yes, fine, okay.
Yeah.
Right. But I think I just have one point to add to that. So the countries as examples that you're giving, Vietnam, Bangladesh and all, are they really global in in the true sense of value chains as such, as limited to certain commodities, in which they have comparative advantage? So that I think they are limited to the.
Sure.
Yeah, right. It's textile is
sure.
One part.
They have the niche spaces.
Right.
Yeah.
So right. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Just to.
We have time to take one more question.
Good evening, sir. Sir, you told that we are aiming to reduce the fiscal deficit by the financial year 26. So, like, can we expect some severe consolidation in the immediate fiscal, like upcoming fiscal?
So the budget for 23-24 has just been announced, and it is having an estimate of 5.9% for 23-24. And then, if you have to achieve 4.5, then you require 70 basis points each, at least on average, in the remaining 2 years. And if you look at the amount of discretionary expenditure that goes into the capex, and hopefully if the private sector can pick up the baton, then there is a room for, because you talk about 10 basis points at today's nominal GDP of 272 lakh crores, works out to about 27,000 crores. So if you reduce, let's say for example in the coming years, if the private sector is willing to step in, and Dr. Rangarajan wrote about it, in the current scheme of things, he says there is not enough resources left for the private sector to pick up the capex baton. I think that can happen in the coming years, and that will give room for the government to step back and let the private sector spend. And if you reduce the, let's say for example, the capex even by 1 lakh crore, that then gives you roughly about 40 basis points based on today's nominal GDP. So it is possible, there is room that exists. That's what I'm trying to say. And more importantly, in the meantime, your nominal GDP, the base itself will be rising. So to achieve 4.5% gross fiscal deficit by 25-26 is eminently feasible. Thank you, sir. No, I agree with you that we have to give a lot of importance to climate change. This is what I did in my speech also. I gave a lot of importance to climate change related topic. And we are giving importance. There is both so there is both public and private sector interest. So in the private sector side, Macquarie and Tata Sons Chandrasekhar are leading the initiative for private sector to think about it in terms of putting the investments in place. And private sectors have already been issuing what are called green bonds, etc. And there are disclosure standards that are coming up for countries to be able to disclose companies to disclose what they are doing on sustainable development and climate change, so that they can attract the right kind of, so much initiatives are already happening. We need to do that, but the question is the right sequencing and which one do we prioritize. This is what I listed in my speech, whether it is adaptation and resilience or mitigation, etc. So the topic is getting the attention it deserves both in the private sector and in the public sector.
I'm afraid we don't have any more time. We'll take that question.
I just want to start with one example. So there is this Prime Minister Jan Dhan Yojana, which was started like a few years back, and the main objective of that program is to ensure greater financial inclusion with allowing like opening bank accounts so that there could be efficient financial like transactions. But beyond that, there could be several behavioral bottlenecks from the parties that are opening, like from whom the accounts are being opened, right? So what will be your take on that in terms of how can we counter, or how can we take those behavioral bottlenecks into account and then move forward to ensure that there is more financial inclusion?
I'm not sure I can fully answer this question because it is somewhat too general. If you look at the data on PMJDY, how they have progressed, initially there were concerns about nil balances, accounts were too many. Now you realize that bulk of the accounts are not only having some balance, but the deposits are actually growing, and it is creating a financial culture, a culture of savings and then thrift as well as access to credit, etc. So unless we are able to, what you have in mind is some specific behavioral bottlenecks or resistance or hurdles, and each one of them will require a very specific nudge to overcome that. It is difficult for me to answer that in general terms. But financial inclusion is a very important priority both for the government and for the central bank. That is why the RBI recently has come up with a financial inclusion index to measure how various states are doing with respect to financial inclusion. And the ability to give even small amounts as credit, both to households and to businesses, has been facilitated by the digitization of the credit culture. So, and that is why we have what is called the Open Credit Enablement Network. So, for example, if let's say a Swiggy or a Zomato has so many of these people who go and deliver food and other items, then they have a fairly good understanding of their people whom they employ as delivery agents, etc. And if they and a financial institution have the same software platform, then this information can be easily shared between them, and that enables that financial institution to be able to track these salary and the savings and the spending behavior of these employees, and the ability to give them credit is very easy because systems will be interoperable. That's exactly what Open Credit Enablement Network is going to, or is beginning to make happen. So in that sense, there has been a lot of exciting developments on financial inclusion, and the PMJDY was just the foundational pillar for it.
Thank you very much, sir. Now it's time to hear from Dr. C. Rangarajan. So I request him to deliver the presidential remarks.
Dr. Nageshwaran, Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, Mrs. Lakshmi Venkataraman Endowment, distinguished invitees, and my young friends. We are happy that we are able to hold the 8th Venkataraman Endowment lecture today, after an interlude. As was remarked earlier, Mr. Venkataraman was a multifaceted personality, one who was deeply involved in the freedom struggle, and one who became an excellent administrator after the independence. As was pointed out in some detail by Dr. Nageshwaran, as a minister, he laid a solid foundation for the industrialization of Tamil Nadu. Many of his ideas, like industrial parks and so on, came to be adopted and followed by other states. As a finance minister, among many other things that was mentioned, he was also fiscally prudent. And he was always sure that this fiscal prudence is maintained. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to work with him. It so happened, my appointment as Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank was made when Mr. Venkataraman was the finance minister. But by the time I took charge as the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, he had left the finance ministry and became the defense minister. But I used to meet him often, or on many occasions. And it was very clear that he had not only the will to steer the economy in the direction of faster economic growth, but also, as I would say, growth with stability. I think that is something that we cannot overlook. Our own history clearly indicates what happened in the 1980s and what kind of a crisis that we faced in 1991. We violated all principles of stability. The current account deficit in those days touched 3% of the GDP. And the fiscal deficit also rose up. It is not known to many that prior to 1980s, there was the revenue surplus in the central government. And the revenue surplus became revenue deficit and an enlarging fiscal adequacy. As President of the India, Venkataraman also showed what the constitutional authority can do and cannot do. It was very clear that all powers emanate from the President. But that does not mean the President is the most powerful person also. I was reading his book, My Presidential Years, and there he says, the President of India is like an emergency light. It comes into operation only when the normal power fades. And that is exactly the principles by which he stood. And I think those principles are extremely relevant even today. I'm extremely thankful to Anant Nageshwaran for his presence today and for delivering a lecture, a talk, which is all embracing, but at the same time quite lucid and quite clear on where he stood. The world, including India, is passing through a difficult time. In the economic crisis that we face is the first economic crisis in recent memory which was triggered by a non-economic factor. We have to go 100 years back to find a similar situation when the Spanish flu triggered something similar. As Nageshwaran pointed out, when we were all thinking that we have gone through the problems of COVID, came the Russian-Ukraine war, and 22-23, which was expected to be a normal year, ceased to be a normal year. Perhaps the most normal year we can expect is in 23-24, and therefore, when we talk about the growth rate in 22-23 or 23-24, we need to keep this in mind, and hopefully that the growth rate that we expect in 23-24 should be assumed to be on a reasonably normal base. The growth rate of 22-23, if you look at it, is largely influenced by the high growth experience in the first half of the year. That was based upon a base year where the economic activity was 4.4% rate of growth for quarter 3. Is that good, bad? I suppose that in the context of the situation that has existed, that a growth rate of 4.4% over a near normal base, but also as he pointed out, the previous numbers have been revised. The base for quarter 3 is somewhat higher, and therefore you get a growth rate of 4.4%. He also indicated that if we have to get to the growth rate of 7% in the current year, the required rate of growth for quarter 4 is something like 5.1%. Can we achieve 5.1% in the quarter 4? Is that going to be difficult? Now, there are people who quote high frequency indicators to indicate that it is possible. But in some sense, he indicated that the growth rate can even be higher than 7%. Let us wait for the second, the third, and the fourth estimate. But I do not know. I think we really have to be very clear whether over normal base the economy has come to a point when it can pick up speed. We really need speed. we really need to grow at a higher growth rate. And 23, 24, there are many numbers. I remember the number of 6.1% given by IMF, 6.4% given by Reserve Bank of India. And the government has been very cautious by giving a range and also giving, Nageshwaran gave some additional justification for 6.5 as a possible number. But I really, at this particular point, not very clear about where we will stand. I would say yes, it will be higher than 6%. Beyond 6%, it is somewhat difficult to predict at this point what it will be. One is the weather factor. We don't know at this point. And some people are even threatening that that can be a bad agricultural year. But strangely, for the last 3 years or more, we have had a good agricultural growth rate. I think this is not normal. We had almost in excess of 3% growth rate in agriculture, which is not normally there. And what will happen to the global system, about which he talked in the beginning. I think that's a very interesting presentation on the global situation, the kind of uncertainties that prevail, and so on. Therefore, I would probably think that the growth rate in 23-24 is somewhere between 6.1% or 6% and 6.5%. I particularly do not feel very strongly that it would be in excess of 6.5 and closer to 6.8%. I think that is somewhat, at this particular point, looks unlikely. So, the whole question really is that what is our aspiration and how do we go from here? The aspiration that is being put out by policymakers is really that over the long haul, by 2047, we should become a developed country. What is the definition of a developed country? The definition of a developed country is in terms of per capita income. That the per capita income of the country should be somewhere around $13,000. That's the kind of definition that they have. But whether 13,000 would be the appropriate number 20 years from now, I do not know. But if I look back at the numbers, I have seen that the number hasn't changed very much. It has been about 12,200 or something to 13,000. Therefore, maybe that number may not be higher. And then, if you look at simple arithmetic and find out the rate of growth that is required on 2 or 3 assumptions, because it also depends upon the exchange rate, behavior of the exchange rate. And it is very often, it also depends upon the nominal growth rate. It doesn't depend upon the real growth rate. Therefore, you finally get to some number on some assumptions that you really need to have a growth rate of 8%. I do not know when. Okay. Somewhere around 8%, 7 to 8% is all that I think we need to make. But in the world of today, whether a 78% rate of growth over 20 years is possible at all is another question, because we talked about many issues like climate change, the actions that have to be taken, and if you really want to reduce the emission of certain gases and so on, maybe from different angles. 78% is not even a desirable rate of growth. But if you really think in terms of per capita income, calculations can give you something of this order. I mean, I have done many manipulations, but I still believe that 78% is what I get. So the point really is that over the long haul, if you have to grow, then what should we do? Some issues like, for example, fiscal stability. He did point out over many things. But I personally believe, he himself said that I may be differing from him, but I not differ in a fundamental sense, differ only in terms of what we really need to do. I think that the present level of fiscal deficit is high. And even the attempt to go to only 4.5% is, in my opinion, somewhat timid. We really need to act more decisively. I say it from 2 or 3 points of view. One is, of course, the point that if the government alone, it does not include public enterprises, if the government alone takes something like 6% of the GDP in the form of savings, then what is left of the private sector, what is left of the public enterprises, and so on. Therefore, when we keep on saying that the private investment also should pick up, there is a problem there. I mean, I think we need to bring down the fiscal deficit as early as possible. I would say that the point that there are other countries which have debt GDP ratio which is higher than ours, and why should we bother about it, is not totally relevant, because the interest payments as a proportion of revenue receipts is very high in India. I think for central government it is very high. Actually, it was even 40%. Maybe that is because of the particular year in which we are looking at. It was coming down somewhere around 32% or something like that. Then it has gone up. Therefore, what it really means, out of the total revenue receipts of the center, nearly 30 to 40% is preempted in the form of revenue interest payments. Then what is left for the rest of the things? Therefore, we really need to ensure that the interest payments come down. And I must also say that the one argument that so long as the growth rate, nominal growth rate is lower than the, is higher than the nominal interest rate, the debt GDP ratio stabilizes, and therefore there is not it's not a problem. I think that's only a partial explanation. I think the role of primary deficit is also critically important. In fact, in much of the period, as far as India is concerned, the rise in the debt GDP ratio is because of the primary deficit. Before 1991, through artificially we kept the rate of interest low. And therefore, when our growth rate is also low, our interest rate was also kept low. And it is that which benefited the government. Therefore, we really, if you want to do it, I would like to suggest in my book on public finance, that is the derivation and the proof for the fact that what should be the role of primary deficit and what it can be. I think the exact derivation is also given. So I would really say that we need to bring down the primary deficit also, and that will get us to a situation in which the debt GDP ratio can come under control. I think the point is, the issue is not a dispute. The question really is whether the system can easily absorb reducing the fiscal deficit from one level to a lower level. Too heavy a shock or too big a shock can also have some discrepancies and disruptions in the system. That's a judgment call, and I think somebody has to make the judgment call, and there can be differences on that score. The point really is, I will not go into the last part of his lecture, which dealt with climate change and so on and so forth. But the point really is that we take pride in the fact that we are the 5th largest economy in the world. Maybe we have moved to 4 or 3 as we are talking, but I still wish to point out, but that is not the only way to look at it. If you look at it in terms of per capita income, we are 142 out of 197 countries. That is a rank. The per capita, being the 5th largest is an achievement by itself. I am not disputing that. I think the aggregate output of India is really very large. And therefore that by itself has an influence over the political system of the globe, not only India, I am not talking of India, political system of the globe. But at the final analysis, the real strength comes by increasing the per capita income. Therefore, we really need to work out a way by which we can increase the overall income, slow down the population growth, which is already happening. The fertility rate has almost come down to about 2.2. I mean, it is very close to 2.1, and that which is the which is equal to the rate at which the population will stabilize. But as you know, that population will not stabilize once the fertility rate comes to that. It takes time after the fertility rate has been reached for the population to stabilize, because demographers call it the momentum. Because of the women who have already entered into the reproductive stage, and therefore the population will not decline that quickly. In fact, according to the calculation, it's only about 2050 the population will start stabilizing. But that's a totally different issue. All that I wish to say is that really we have a need to increase the per capita income, which will again depend upon our ability to pick the growth rate at the appropriate level. But the choice of picking the growth rate at that level is also not entirely ours. There are other considerations which I mentioned, and therefore we will have to work out a balance on how to do it. Let me say that we talk about growth. I suppose we are talking strictly in terms of the financial calculations. The investment rate is X, the incremental capital output ratio is X, and therefore we can grow at that rate. But somebody had asked the question about aggregate savings rate. I think the point really is the aggregate savings rate. The aggregate savings is not necessarily a function of interest rate. It is really the composition of savings which may be a function of the interest rate. Because strictly speaking, in the Keynesian analysis, income minus consumption is savings, and consumption is a function of income, and therefore savings as a residual is a function of income. It is not. But then it is a disputed issue. I mean, I have myself written on it, but I think it's a disputed issue. But coming back to the point, these are the investment rate, the required investment rate, the ICOR, the incremental capital output ratio, is a number. Actually, that number can only be derived. That number is not actually given there, somewhere there. Therefore, you really have to work towards many other factors, which he also mentioned towards the end, nearly skilling and so on and so forth, because the pattern of growth hereafter is going to be different. Now, if artificial intelligence and other things come into the picture, then the labor that we require is going to be of a different order from the labor that we now have. Therefore, there are many other factors which we need to look into it. But I would only say that the required rate of growth that we need in order to be able to get the people, majority of the people, to get a reasonable standard of living is high. We have to work towards it, And as I mentioned, growth must go with stability. I think the idea that somehow stability can be sacrificed and growth will happen is not even substantiated by our own history. And therefore, the objective should be growth with stability. And I think we have learned a lot on that in this evening from Anant Nageshwaran. Once again, I would like to thank him for accepting our invitation to be here.
Thank you very much, sir, for your insightful comment on today's endowment lecture. Now I request Mrs. Lakshmi Venkataraman Endowment to deliver the vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a blessing it has been to have such eminent personalities like Shri Anant Nageshwaran and Shri Rangarajan address us today. The Shri R.Venkataraman Endowment Lecture, which the Madras School of Economics, under the able guidance of its chairman, Mr. Rangarajan, and with the support of my sister Padma and her late husband K. Venkataraman, has diligently been following and has had many, many renowned speakers, as we heard from Dr. Shanmugam. I think Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran has taken that tradition to new heights. First, I'd like to acknowledge the grace and humility of you, Dr. Anant. When I first visited you a few months back, not only did you agree to deliver this lecture, I don't know how you thought about it because you had an extremely tight schedule, budget was coming up, G20 was on everyone's head, and so on and so forth. But you emphasized time and again that you considered it your honor and duty, and therefore, we really appreciate it. And we all know Dr. Anant wears many hats: academician, economist, banking and investment expert, but few know that he's also someone who's worn the hat of a venture capital for micro enterprises in Avishkar. And that kind of a pioneering work was very evident because when you spoke about India's place in the global economic landscape, you talked about formalizing street vendors. You talked about youth skilling. You talked about local level partnerships. You talked about MSME enhancement. The kind of language, I think the basis for which the Amatur and the Gindi industrial estate were all there. Therefore, this would have warmed my father's heart very much to see the way you brought the global to the local. On behalf of the RV family and Madras School of Economics, I do hope, sir, that you will continue to interact with us and will continue to be a part of this family for a long time to come. Mr. Rangarajan, it is hard to thank you because you are a giant personality in your own right, and you have known my father and have had deep intellectual interest and mutual respect for each other that goes back far beyond anything that I know about. However, what I learned, sir, today is the deep regard and respect with which you spoke about him for the foundations he laid in the 1980s as a finance minister. And I would just like to add a small anecdote. When he first presented his budget, my father said, he went to Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister, and said, "I'm not a magician, I'm only a finance minister. Tell me one thing that you would like me to do." And since the previous Charan Singh government had inflation rate of over 14%, so Indira Gandhi said, "We need to help the common man, so can you bring that down?" Which he did, to 4%. And to show the gratitude, there was a cartoon of my father being kissed by a common housewife. And that was appeared, I believe, in the Hindu, if I'm not mistaken, Kesha. And essentially, that is now in the Rashtrapati Bhavan presidential portraits and so on and so forth. So, very much, Dr. Rangarajan, you were absolutely right in the way you were able to characterize the kind of support and the kind of work that he had done. But you, sir, we also owe you a deep debt of gratitude because you have kept the kind of, you've been able to attract and support this endowment lecture with fabulous speakers. Were it not for your stature, it would be hard to attract such people, and therefore, we are greatly indebted to you also. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Shanmugam. You will acknowledge and appreciate your organization efforts to make the R.V. Endowment Lecture a resounding success year after year. And of course, the students of MSc, I think, add a great deal of color and flavor based by the kind of questions we got today to these heavy-duty lectures of import. Last but not the least, I would like to thank you, Gopalji. I would like to thank you, Tara. I would like to thank all of you who have come here today for your warm and gracious presence. I'm sure you felt my father's spirit, which I've been gladdened to, for sure, to see such a gathering talk about not only about him, but the importance and the love he had for India. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I'm afraid with that we are coming to an end. So we will finish the program with the national anthem. So please rise.
जनगणमन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Thank you very much. Please join us for a high tea outside.